Let's break down Venezuela and connect some dots. Let's talk about how this little country got stuck in the middle of a tug of war between the United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and even Iran is connected with this little country. It's a real geopolitical war that is going on, and it really kind of helps us understand the mess that is happening in Venezuela right now, the coup. I firmly believe that the United States is behind a lot of this, and that we're trying to do things for our own best interest and not for the Venezuelan people. And we're going to connect some dots here so that you can also talk about this with your friends and family and the people like I know I get in my life who don't believe it and believe that Maduro needs to be overturned because he's committing human rights abuses in Venezuela and they need democracy returned back. You know, that's what our narrative is. So let's talk about this. Let's go back to when Chavez became president, or I don't know what they call him, leader, or, you know, the leader of Venezuela. Chavez was elected by a landslide in 1998, and it was really similar to what's going on in today's political atmosphere here in the United States. The Venezuelan people were really fed up with their political system being co-opted and taken by the wealthy class. Essentially, all the money in Venezuela was going for the rich. The rich were getting wealthier, the poor were getting poorer, and it was really causing a serious strain on the Venezuelan people. For about 10 years, they had been rising up and rioting and revolting. And it was because really, if you back it up even further, they had a very stable political system in Venezuela for a very long time. They were one of the most, if not the most, stable Latin American country. But then there was a period of time in the 80s and 90s when the people started to realize their government was taken by the rich, and they started to riot. And the president started austerity, and it was just really, the people had enough. It was very similar, actually, in that 10-year period where the Venezuelan people were rising up. I would say it was very similar to what's going on in France right now, where the middle class and the poor were like, hey, listen, you're trying to tax us and put the burden on us, and the rich are getting wealthier, and we're the ones suffering, and we're not going to take it anymore. And so they started rioting, and they started really pushing back. For about 10 years, this went on. I mean, revolutions don't happen overnight. I know people like to think so because of what we read in history books, but it's a lot longer of a process. And so rose Hugo Chavez, who was very much a populist for the people leader. I would say he's very similar to a Bernie Sanders. And he said, you know what, we need to take the country back for the people. We need to give the money back to the people. We need to get the wealthy class out and return Venezuela to the Venezuelan people. He wins by a landslide. The people want him in office. He gets in office. One of the first things he does. Now, this is where it begins. This is when the United States says, okay, Venezuela, you're now on our list. We're going to come after you. And this is when Hugo Chavez decided that he was going to take back the oil operations for Venezuela and kick out the U.S. oil companies. So they have the largest oil reserves in the world. Venezuela does. It's an untapped resource. They are not the largest exporter of oil by any means. They're not even in the top 10, but they do have the largest known oil reserves. So Hugo Chavez, knowing this, kicks out the companies that are down there trying to take the oil from the Venezuelan people and instead turn the profits in the United States, namely ConocoPhillips, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and also UK's BP, Norway's Statoil, France's Total. These were all companies that were down there making money off of Venezuelans' oil, and Hugo Chavez says, no more to this. No more. You guys are out. We're nationalizing the oil, and we're not allowing you to take advantage of our natural resource anymore. When he did that, the Venezuelan country became really rich, right? As they should. I mean, it's their natural resource. So all of a sudden, money started flowing into the country. Hugo Chavez put that money where he said he was going to put it. He started building up the people. Their poverty rates raised up. People got out of poverty. There's 20% increase. I don't know if I'm saying that right. 20% less people were poor. And their literacy rates went up. Their medicines, they had higher life rates. I'm not saying any of these rights, but you get what I'm saying. Everything improved, okay? And all of that was going really well for Venezuela. But when Hugo Chavez said, we're getting all of these foreign countries out, that is when the sanctions started happening. And that is when the United States specifically started to push back and say, okay, you're going to mess with us. You're going to mess with our corporate profits. We're going to start messing with you. And the United States started to issue some sanctions and put pressure on Venezuela in order to get them to go back to allowing for big corporations to come in and make money off of that oil. In fact, here's this interesting article that was written in 2007. This is from The Guardian. This says, the Venezuelan president, Hugo Chavez, today severed ties with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. In doing so, he distanced Caracas further from what he described as Washington-dominated institutions. The populist leader who took office pledging to pursue radical political reform and an economic third way said yesterday that Venezuela no longer needed institutions dominated by U.S. imperialism. Speaking at a May Day event, Mr. Chavez said, "We don't need to be going up to Washington. We are going to get out. I want to formalize our exit from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund." Venezuela has been loosening its ties to the IMF and the World Bank since Mr. Chavez took office in 1999. Venezuela recently repaid its debts to the World Bank 5 years ahead of schedule. In doing so, it saved $8 million and cleared all of its debts to the IMF shortly after Mr. Chavez was elected. So he got their country out of debt. He took their natural resource back, and that's how he was able to do this. He raised up the poverty, raised people out of poverty, raised people, their life expectancy, their medicines, their literacy rates. Everything was going great in Venezuela. And then he says, and I'm going to sever ties with the World Bank and with the International Monetary Fund. So why this is important is because if you watched a previous video I did about the petrodollar, you'd understand that the United States has a partnership deal with Saudi Arabia. This video, by the way, is going to be really long, and I ask that you stick with me because I did a lot of research for this. So the least you could do is watch this video. So the United States and Saudi Arabia, they did a big deal where it was the United States left the gold-backed standard for our dollar, and we instead did a deal with the devil, with Saudi Arabia. And we said, listen, you guys have all the oil, and what we want to do is have the dollar's value tied to the oil markets. And the way to do that, the way you tie that is you force everybody to buy oil with dollars. And this is where the crux of the issue is. And this is how Russia comes into play and how Iran comes into play and Saudi Arabia comes into play in this whole mess, is that the United States says, we're going to, Saudi Arabia, we're going to do a deal with you we're going to give you weapons and security. In exchange, we want you to buy and sell oil in U.S. dollars. This will raise the value of the dollar because every nation will now need to secure dollars in order to get oil. So that means if you are Russia and you need U.S. dollars in order to buy oil, this pisses you off because now the United States, knowing that in order for you to get the dollars, you're beholden to the United States. So you need to do what we want in order to get these dollars. Otherwise, we're not going to get you we're going to make it really difficult for you to get your hands on dollars. And that's going to then make it very difficult for you to get what you need for your people to survive, which is oil. Nobody likes this deal because of that. No other nation thought this was a good idea. The United States thinks it's a great idea. Much of the West who are allies with the United States thinks it's great. But if you're not an ally with the United States, it's not so good because now you're basically beholden to this big behemoth, over here. So that's what Chavez is talking about when he says, I want to sever ties and I want to get out of this. Now, this was very scary because here's the deal. They've got all the oil. They got a ton of oil on their own, so they don't really need to be beholden to this system. They could actually create their own system with all of their oil. So what we started to do was we started to make it very difficult for them to actually tap into their oil resource. We made it very difficult for them to refine it and get the infrastructure that they need in order to do this. That's how we started implementing the sanctions. We started to try to bankrupt them by squeezing them and by saying, okay, you've got this big resource, but you can't sell the resource without being able to extract it and refine it. We've got the infrastructure for that. We're not going to let you use it. We're also not going to allow you to borrow money in order to build it. We're not going to let you do any of that. And so we basically said, you and your oil, it's going to be worthless because you're not playing ball the way that we want you to. we want to still control you. We want to have the relationship with you that we have with Saudi Arabia at minimum, or we want our big companies to come in and be able to make a ton of money off of it, which is what they were doing, and we don't like that you kick them out. So that is when it all began. It was 2007, a little bit before that, when Chavez took the oil back to the Venezuelan people and started severing ties with this deal that was going on with the United States and saying, we're not going to do this anymore. Now, you fast forward past Chavez, he dies, Maduro takes over. Now, when Chavez died, we saw a big opportunity to potentially go in and change the system. Of course, right? Because the leader now who was doing all of this is dead. It's like what we were waiting for with Castro in Cuba. So you wait for the guy to die and you hope that you can swoop in and get your own leader in and somebody who's friendly to you. But that didn't happen. The Venezuelan people put in another guy who was going to continue Chavez's legacy, and that was Maduro. So immediately Maduro walks into an extremely hostile situation. He's not wanted there by the West. The West is trying to get him out. They're calling the elections from the beginning illegitimate. They're trying to basically, from the time he stepped foot into office, they basically have been trying to delegitimize him and destabilize the nation and blame it on Maduro. It's a little bit easier to do on Maduro. Chavez was very much loved by the people. It's a lot easier to do to the successor than it is to the guy who actually ushered in the revolution. So that's what we've been doing to Maduro, is we've been trying to take that oil back. What we want is we want Venezuela to be U.S. friendly. Like I said, we want them to either give us the ability to capitalize on their oil, or we want a deal similar to what Saudi Arabia's got with Venezuela. The way we decided to do it was, instead of being friends and instead of supporting them in what they're wanting to do, we decided to try to squeeze them and bankrupt them and collapse them. Not good, not a very good strategy. And because we decided to do that, Russia actually decides to swoop in and says, we'll be friends, we'll help you out. So when Venezuela started to feel a lot of pressure when the economy collapsed in 2008, and again when the oil prices collapsed in 2014, and Venezuela was really in a bind, that is when Russia swooped in and said, we'll help you out. So they started giving them loans, started giving them money, and also started developing a deal with Venezuela like what we have with Saudi Arabia. What they said to Venezuela is, we'll give you protection in exchange for, some kind of relationship in regards to this oil. So they started investing in their oil companies and building up a friendly relationship. That is why Russia now, when you're watching the news, they're talking about Putin and Venezuela. They're talking about Russia and the military. And you've got Russia denying it. You've got Trump believing that Russia is not involved. Russia is involved. I'm not trying to demonize that situation, so I don't want you to take that way. But for sure, Russia is involved in Venezuela. They've put a lot of money into Venezuela. They've invested a lot of money into Maduro. They 100% are trying to protect their investment and their relationship. Because, like I said before, nobody likes this relationship the United States has with Saudi Arabia. Nobody likes that friendship that has allowed the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to control the world's oil markets and to prop up the U.S. dollar and the power that we have, the geopolitical power that we have around the world, because everyone needs to get these dollars. So Putin's plan, along with China, they're doing this together, which you can't really blame them, is to somehow get out of this vice grip that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have on them. And their plan was, well, if we start allying and building up relationships with other nations who have a lot of oil, then we could get a foothold on the world's oil markets. We could start trading, buying and selling with rubles or whatever they want to buy and sell it with. And then we can do what the United States is doing. And why not? I mean, why wouldn't you if you were them? You of course would. You would of course would, because that's what competitors would do. So that's what they've been doing. So Russia's been going around making friends with countries like Venezuela and Iran and Iraq. They were friends with Iraq before the fall of Saddam Hussein. These are all nations with huge oil reserves and the largest exporters in the world, along with Russia. Russia's number 2, by the way. So if Russia can get their hands on being the second largest oil reserves, if they can then get with Iran and Iraq and Venezuela, now Iraq's kind of out of the picture for them, but if they could get their hands on, just allied with these other nations, then they could create their own system and buy and sell that is not in US dollars. So here's where things get really messy and why things have escalated now over the last, I'd say since 2016, things have really escalated with Venezuela. What happened was the Iran nuclear deal. Obama did this in 2015. This actually really upset Saudi Arabia. I don't want to get into the details of why, but you just know they were really mad about it. They didn't like this deal at all, but Obama struck it anyway. So when that happened, Saudi Arabia and Russia had always had a rivalry. They were not friends. But in 2016, they started to become friends. Saudi Arabia started to kind of feel like the U.S. was turning on Saudi Arabia. And so they decided, you know what, we're going to make some inroads with some other places. So they started to do things with Russia, started to have some investments with one another. They worked together on stabilizing the oil prices after the crash in 2014. And for the first time, the king of Saudi Arabia visited Russia in 2017. And that was the first time that anyone from the monarchy had done that. So that was a really big deal. So Trump comes along and finds out that the Saudis, what their real beef is the Iran nuclear deal. And that is why they're starting to make these inroads with Russia, which is threatening to the United States because in order for our dollar to remain propped up and valuable, we need the Saudis. So this was very alarming. And that's why we backed out of the Iran nuclear deal. That was one of the big reasons of backing out, was to get in good favor again with the Saudis. But it didn't really work. The Saudis kind of said, you know what? Yeah, we see this and that's great and all, but we don't really trust you. And we certainly don't trust the next president that comes in. So we're going to keep on working with Russia. So they've continued this. They've continued their relationship, building their relationship with Russia, which is very scary to the United States. And like I said, the propping up of our dollar. This is a real problem. So that is how Saudi Arabia is connected and Iran is connected to this debacle that's going on in Venezuela. Because when all of this happened, when we started to see, okay, Saudi Arabia is still not backing down from the relationship with Russia, and Russia's now making friends with Venezuela and making friends with Saudi Arabia and made friends already with Iran, oh no, we're in a world of trouble. So that is why we put maximum pressure on Venezuela at this time. That is why we put maximum pressure to get Maduro out and Guaido in, who was raised and went to school here in the United States and has gone down there to try to take Venezuela back for the United States. That is why we have gone full court press on Venezuela. That's why we pretty much staged the coup on Tuesday that did not work. That is why we're really, really putting the squeeze on them. Because we're feeling the squeeze from Saudi Arabia and Russia and Iran, and we're getting really nervous. And you know what? To be quite honest with you, we have good reason to be nervous, because that deal we made with the devil, with Saudi Arabia, has really put us in a serious situation. And I'm not sure. There's only one way I can see out of this. But the issue is that our dollar is reliant. The value of our dollar is reliant on that oil market and on Saudi Arabia dominating that oil market and on Saudi Arabia continuing the deal with us. Now, the minute Saudi Arabia decides not to do that deal, we're screwed. The dollar crashes. The minute that somebody else like Russia gets a hold of the majority of the world's oil reserves, like in Venezuela, we're screwed. The dollar crashes. The dollar crashing, guys, is not a good thing. That means we immediately go into serious despair. Talk about the Great Depression times 10. It would be terrible. There would be a lot of death. It would be really bad. It's really, really bad. So a lot of these wars that we've been going into, a lot of these regime change wars, has been in an effort to secure because all of these other countries, and if you go back and watch that video, like Libya and Iraq and Syria and Venezuela, they've all said basically that they want out of this. They don't want the U.S. to control the oil market anymore. And they want out. And so whenever anybody kind of had any opposition to this, we went in and we decided to start war and get them out. Now, I'm not saying that's good, and I'm totally against regime change war, but I also understand that the dollar crashing is a serious, serious problem. What I also think is a serious problem is that no one's been upfront with us about this. No one's told us the truth. They just keep saying it's a humanitarian crisis, and that's why we're going into these different places, because they have brutal dictators who are murdering their people or committing human rights abuses. In Venezuela, the only human rights abuses they can cite are attacks on freedom of the press and free speech and protesters. It's really no different than the attacks that we've had here in the United States by our own governments. They're not, when they talk human rights abuses, when they say human rights abuses in Venezuela, it is not the stuff that you think of when you think human rights abuses. I've read the reports. I've read the congressional reports, the congressional research reports. That's the Congress's think tank, the think tank that puts together the reports for them in bipartisan ways so that they can read it and make decisions on how they're going to govern. I've read those reports. The reports do not cite the same types of human rights abuses you and I think of when we think of human rights abuses. They talk about, like I said, attacks on freedom of speech and journalism. I mean, it's no different than really what's going on here. I know I already said that. So, if we want to talk about going places and saving people from human rights abuses, it wouldn't be Venezuela. It would be places like the Congo, where people are being raped and murdered. I mean, real physical violence. That's where we'd be going. We wouldn't be going to places where the president decides to kick out a journalist or put him in jail. That's stuff we do. That's not a human rights abuse. That's not enough of a human rights abuse to justify throwing a guy out of office. Could you imagine if the UK did that? If all of these 250 years the UK was like, you know what? We've always resented the Revolutionary War and we want America back. That's ours and we want it back. We want the great prosperity of America back. So they look at this election and they say, oh, the 2016 election was illegitimate. Definitely didn't win really. Donald Trump didn't win really. Democracy has crumbled in the United States. And look what he's doing. He's committing human rights abuses by extradite. Look what he's doing to Julian Assange. I know they're kind of in on it too, but follow me. And look what look at how he treats Jim Acosta. Look at how how they lie, and he always calls it the fake news. And this is an attack on free speech. This is an attack on democracy. This was illegitimate. We need to go in and overthrow him. It's not really justifiable. Not really. And that's what's going on down in Venezuela. So we cannot have the dollar crashing. That is for sure. We made a deal with the devil. That is also for sure. What they should have been telling us this whole time is that we need to get out of this deal with Saudi Arabia. We need to get out of that deal, and we need to get the dollar to where it's propped up on its own and not through somebody else being able to just flip a switch and crash us. It would be that simple. And the fact that Russia and China and these other nations are working to try to get their own deals going, again, will crash us. We're in a world of hurt. We're in a situation here, and they're not being honest with us about it. So what now? Well, I get it. I understand that this is a choice between two devils. You either allow the dollar to crash, which is horrible, and you can't allow that to happen, or you affect regime change in places to keep that secure. Both options suck. But I can understand. I'm not justifying it. I don't want you to think that. But I can understand, if you're put in that decision as a leader, why you would choose instead to protect your people and squash another group of people. Where I really take issue with this is that this deal that was done with Saudi Arabia was done decades ago. And they could have absolutely worked on a way to get out of this deal. And they also, especially with green energy, could have really put a lot of effort into getting us into our own sustainable energy and off fossil fuels. If we got off fossil fuels, we would no longer be reliant on the oil markets, and we would be able to figure out a way to get out of this deal that we've got going on with Saudi Arabia and propping up the dollar. We would figure out a way. That's where our leaders have failed us. They've instead decided that the better course of action is to continue to try to effect regime change around the world rather than actually solve the original sin, which was the deal with the devil with Saudi Arabia to begin with. Now here we are turning a blind eye to their genocide in Yemen. We're turning a blind eye to the fact that they chop up journalists in embassies, and yet we're accusing Venezuela of committing human rights abuses for maybe putting a journalist in jail, which I'm not saying is a good thing, but it's certainly not the same as chopping one up. So here we are in this scenario where our leaders have put us in this situation, and they've kept us in this situation, and they haven't been honest with us about it. So what do? We need to get off fossil fuels. This is why something like the Green New Deal or something like it, Tulsi Gabbard's bill, anything this is what we need to be doing. We need to be heading in that direction, and quickly. And it's not just about climate change. Now, send this video to your conservative friends who maybe they don't agree, maybe they don't believe, maybe they're climate change deniers, or maybe they just think it's not that serious. But I'll tell you what is serious: the dollar collapsing. That is serious. And maybe that will wake them up to the realization that this is a geopolitical crisis, that we could potentially collapse. Our economy will collapse. It is going to happen eventually. We cannot continue on this path. We will not win every regime change war. We will eventually lose this battle. This is a long road to losing, is what this is. We need to get off those fossil fuels. We need to do it now. And we need to be able to get our dollar in a situation to where it is secured by something other than oil. And everybody, whether you be a Democrat or a Republican, should be screaming about this. We need to change this system. We cannot continue in this way that we've been going on. We will collapse. It will be devastating. It might not happen today. Trump might be able to push it off. Obama was able to push it off. They're all able to push it off with the regime change wars and trying to control the situation through force. They couldn't quite do it all the time through manipulating and sanctions, so they're trying to do it with force in some cases. Now they're threatening potential military action in Venezuela. We need to get serious, and we need to get real on this. We made a deal with the devil, and we need to work a way out